In this video, we will learn how the Romans rose to power in Europe. We'll see how their culture got mixed with Greek culture and how their government changed from a monarchy to an empire. And then we'll find out how the Roman Empire fell apart. Get ready for the epic saga of Rome. A long time ago in Italy, there were two small villages named Roma in 753 BCE. According to legend, they were ruled by kings, but really they were probably ruled by the most powerful man in each village. These men had become so powerful because they had conquered many neighboring towns and villages. They kept conquering more land until all the Italian peninsula was theirs. So then they started conquering other places like Sicily and Spain. But this was hard to do because they were still just a group of villages. There wasn't even a real name for them yet. They would have been called Italians, but that word didn't exist back then either. So one day, some leaders met together and decided to unite the villages into one city. This is when Rome was born, and it was pretty special. For one thing, unlike most cities in those days, Rome was ruled by a group of people instead of a king. This group was made up of three branches of government. First, you had the consuls, who were like presidents. They commanded the military and passed laws. Next, there were the patricians, who were like landowners. They controlled most of the wealth in Rome. Then you had the plebeians, who were the common folk, merchants, artisans, farmers, and the like. Now, while Rome was pretty special, it was nothing compared to Greece. Over in Greece, there were already big, beautiful cities with great art and great ideas. In fact, the Greeks invented democracy, philosophy, and the Olympic Games. You know, that poem that says, "Rome wasn't built in a day"? Well, it turns out Rome was actually built in a day, at least compared to Greece. Rome only became great after it interacted with Greece. You see, Rome was right across the Mediterranean from Greece, but it took centuries for them to interact much. Most of the time, Rome was busy conquering people around Italy. But eventually, Rome conquered everyone in Italy, and so they started looking for new lands to conquer. And they found Greece, which was perfect because they could easily invade Greece by boat. So Rome attacked Greece, but they quickly learned that fighting the Greeks was harder than fighting other Italians. You see, the Greeks were more united than the Italians had been, and they were much better at fighting wars. So Rome lost many battles against the Greeks, and they knew they needed help. So Rome reached out to Carthage, which was a powerful city on the other side of the Mediterranean. They asked Carthage if they could conquer Greece, and Carthage said yes, as long as Rome promised not to attack anyone west of Greece. So Rome attacked the Greeks, and they easily won. You see, Rome had a huge advantage over the Greeks. Rome had fresh troops who were eager to fight, but the Greeks had professional soldiers who were tired of fighting. Basically, Rome had conscripts and the Greeks had veterans. Also, Rome had a strong navy that the Greeks did not expect. Anyway, Rome defeated the Greeks and added their territory to their empire. Now, one might think that this would make Rome cocky and arrogant, but Rome was too busy taking over the entire Mediterranean to care about being cocky. They fought many wars against Carthage, and eventually they conquered the entire Mediterranean. This is what we call the Punic Wars. It was during these wars that Rome met Hannibal, who was one of the greatest generals in history. He led armies from the mountains of Spain to the deserts of Africa and the plains of Italy. Hannibal almost defeated Rome, but he couldn't do it because Rome kept attacking Carthage from behind. Eventually, Rome did defeat Carthage and take over their lands, and that's why today you can speak Spanish in Spain and Catalan in Catalonia. But now let's get back to Rome. So Rome became the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean, but they had a problem. They were a republic, but they ruled like a monarchy. Here's how. You see, Rome had no king, but there were still only a few people who had all the power. These people were the patricians. Meanwhile, most of the population of Rome were plebeians, and they had no power at all. Sure, they could vote, but the patricians always agreed on who should be consul. So basically voting was useless. But eventually the plebeians got fed up and went on strike. They refused to grow food, build ships, or fight in the army. And this caused lots of problems for Rome because without food, Rome would starve. Without ships, Rome couldn't go to war. And without soldiers, Rome would lose every war. So Rome was desperate to end the strike. They tried giving the plebs little jobs in the government, but that didn't work. They kept striking. So finally, Rome gave them one major position in the government, the position of tribune of the plebs. This ended the strike and started the decline of the Roman Republic. Here's how. Now, before this, if the patricians wanted to make a law, they had to convince the plebeians to make it a law. But now the tribunes of the plebs could block any law they didn't like, even if the patricians agreed on it. So now the patricians had to convince both the patricians and the plebeians to make a law. And this made the laws better, but it also slowed down the government. That's because there were so many people involved in making laws, and this meant that things took longer to get done. This wasn't the only thing that weakened the Roman Republic. Another big problem was that there were too many generals. You see, generals used to be appointed by the consuls, but now generals were elected by the people. And this meant that generals could become very popular and powerful. I mean, just imagine if the President of the United States ran for Senate. That's how big of a deal this was. Soon enough, generals were becoming consuls. And when they became consuls, they appointed themselves as generals again and started raising armies bigger than the Roman army. And this brings us to Caesar, who was the first person to ever cross the Rubicon. This was a river that separated Italy from the rest of the empire, and crossing it with an army meant starting a war. So Caesar was technically a traitor, but the people loved him. You see, Julius Caesar was the most famous general in Rome. He had defeated the Gauls, who were giants compared to the Romans. He had taken over Gaul, and he had even made Cleopatra queen of Egypt, and he was so popular that the people of Rome wanted to make him king. Now, remember, Rome wasn't supposed to have a king, but that didn't matter because Caesar wasn't going to be a king. He was going to be emperor. He was going to rule Rome with absolute power. But before he could take control, he was assassinated by a group of senators. Now you would think this would restore order to Rome, but it actually did the opposite. Caesar had two adopted sons, Octavian and Agrippa. Octavian avenged his father by defeating Caesar's assassins. And then he went on to become the first emperor of Rome. Rome was now an empire, and it was going to last for hundreds of years. The Pax Romana had begun. Under the Pax Romana, Rome experienced a golden age of peace and prosperity. They built roads, aqueducts, public buildings, temples, everything. They even invented concrete, which is something we use every day. It was during the Pax Romana that Rome spread its culture throughout the empire. Now, you might think this was easy, but it wasn't. Culture is very complicated. If you try to force your culture onto someone, they will usually reject it. But the Romans never forced their culture onto anyone. Instead, they spread their culture through trade. If you traded with Rome, you could buy Roman goods, adopt Roman customs, and even learn Latin. So basically, the Romans spread their culture without trying to spread their culture. But the Pax Romana didn't last forever. In fact, it ended sooner than you might think. In 180 A.D., the Emperor Marcus Aurelius died and Rome entered a civil war. For the next 2 centuries, the empire was ruled by military dictators. This period is known as the crisis of the 3rd century. Rome barely held on during this crisis, but by the year 284, things started getting better. The Emperor Diocletian divided the empire into 2 halves and appointed a co-emperor to rule each half. Now, this saved Rome because it made the empire easier to manage and defend. But it also doomed Rome because now the empire was splitting apart. During the next century, the western half of the empire kept getting weaker and weaker. And in 476, the last emperor of Rome was overthrown by a Germanic soldier named Odoacer. Some historians say that was the end of the Roman Empire. But others say it didn't end until the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, was destroyed in 1453. So which is it? Was 476 the end of Rome, or was it 1453? Well, I think it was both. I mean, sure, the western half of the Roman Empire collapsed in 476, but the eastern half did and collapsed until 1453. So I guess you could say the Roman Empire lasted for 19 centuries. In my opinion, the fall of Rome was inevitable. It was bound to happen sooner or later because the government was too slow, the emperors were too greedy, and the generals were too powerful. Plus, Rome was huge. It was the biggest empire in history, and ruling such a large area is incredibly difficult. Still, it's impressive that it lasted for so long. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to watch another video, you can click here. If you want to learn something random, you can click here. And if you want to support the channel, you can click here. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye.